Hi everyone. In this video, I would like to use a simple clay model to demonstrate how we get from three-dimensional structures within the cerebral hemispheres to the two-dimensional horizontal sections with the structures that you have to identify. So before we get to that, let's first be orientated to know what we are looking at here. And this model was not built to scale, it's really just to show the relationship of the structures with each other. So here we have the lateral ventricle, the gray structure here, we can see the anterior horn, the body, and the posterior horn, and you can also see the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. This here will be the third ventricle, which is that space in the middle, and the thalamus in red, the structure that is in the lateral wall of the third ventricle. You can see a bit of the intrathalamic adhesion which connects the two thalami. Then laterally, the blue structure, that will be the lentiform nucleus. The yellow will be the internal capsule which passes between the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus in green, or pass between the lentiform nucleus and the thalamus. So let's look at the one on the right hand side, the structures in the right cerebral hemisphere. So you can again see the lateral ventricle, and if I remove that lateral ventricle, you can see that green caudate nucleus, which is that curved structure with the head, the body, the tail, and the tail all the way around, and the anterior end of the tail you can see the amygdaloid body. And then again you can see how that lentiform nucleus, the blue, situated laterally, and in between the thalamus caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus we have the internal capsule in yellow that passes between those structures. So then remember the internal capsule. That is your projection fibers which ascend and descend, those pathways ascending and descending. So your internal capsule will fan out into the cerebral hemispheres, and that is where it forms the corona radiata. This inferior part of the internal capsule projects into the crus of the midbrain, the crus cerebri. Then I also want you to note, if I put the lateral ventricle back, how that caudate nucleus is related to the lateral ventricle. So the caudate nucleus, that green, always lateral in the lateral wall of the lateral ventricle. Okay. So now hopefully you have an idea of the three-dimensional picture, how these structures are related to each other. Now a typical horizontal section is made at this level through the third ventricle and through the thalami. So then you have to understand that when you make a horizontal cut, you don't cut through all of the structures because these are three-dimensional structures. So you will only cut through certain parts of it. If I remove that, you make a horizontal cut through the caudate nucleus, you will only cut through certain parts of it, so you won't see the whole caudate nucleus on a horizontal section. So there's your typical horizontal section. And then if we do separate it, that is then more or less what you would see. Just remove that. Okay. So then you see your third ventricle in the middle and the two thalami in the lateral walls of the third ventricle. Then for the lateral ventricle, you only see the anterior horns and the posterior horns, because again, remember the three-dimensional structure, you only cut through the anterior and posterior horns. Then the same for the caudate nucleus. You only see the head and the tail of the caudate nuclei. because again, remember that cut specifically through the head and the tail of the caudate nuclei. And then note how the head of the caudate nucleus is always lateral to the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and the tail of the caudate nucleus always lateral to the posterior horn. The tail here is quite big because it isn't built to scale, but in a true specimen, the tail of the caudate nucleus is really a small brown structure that you might see next to the posterior horn. In between the caudate nucleus and thalamus and the lentiform nucleus is where you then find that internal capsule, that projection fibers ascending and descending between these basal nuclei. So that will be the anterior limb, the genu, and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And again, for the lentiform nucleus, this medial part is called the globus pallidus, and the outer wedge will be the putamen. I have not indicated in this clay model the external capsule, the claustrum and extreme capsule. Remember, those are also structures that you would identify in a horizontal section. I also have not indicated the corpus callosum, which you will also find in a horizontal section. You only see it as the forceps minor and major, or the genu and the splenium. Okay. But yes, I hope that this helps you to understand just how do we get from this when we make a section to that. Okay. Maybe if I put them together like this to also let you see that relationship, maybe this will also help a bit. Okay, let me just put it down if it will work with me. Goodness gracious. Okay. Okay, there you go. So now you can also see the three-dimensional structures. The thalamus medially. Remember, the caudate nucleus is that curved structure, almost around the thalamus. Okay, so the caudate nucleus there, but you made that cut, you only intersected certain parts. Then your lentiform nucleus, internal capsule, the yellow, lentiform nucleus, the blue. Right. Hope that helps. Thank you for watching.
This video was partially sponsored by Dirisana Plus, an EU-funded project.